The sound world that I love finds its roots in the very creation of that sound, through the gesture itself. And what excites me the most in music is the complexity in those sounds, and the shapes of those sounds, and the colors of those sounds. How are they portrayed? What is the performer saying? What is the composer calling for? And I find this particularly relevant in old music and relatively new music. And that's why I pulled together these pieces from such different times for this recording, because I want to invite you into this sound world. So these are some of my favorite pieces by some of my favorite composers, and I hope that you will be drawn into the complexity of their sounds, the complexity of their gestures, and sort of these cross relationships that I'm going to draw through this album. Through the recording, we're going to move through tonally sophisticated, developed, and embellished forms of gesture, like in the Bach, and even earlier in the Galli. And then we'll move into the more pure mechanisms of gesture found in Feldman and Lachenmann. And then finally, we'll jump into the super exaggerated gestures of Xenakis in Kotos. Part of appreciating the complexity and finding the beauty in these pieces involves understanding both the instructions, what's on the page, the score, and how those instructions are physically translated into real sounds. I think you'll find it very surprising how similar some of the elements of these pieces are when you look through that lens. So in this Bach prelude, it's a very free piece just by the nature of it being a prelude, but also the fact that it was written by Bach. He was a master of improvisation. But there are a few things you can gather from the score. In a very simple form, you can just follow what's happening visually. And we see that it starts low and it flourishes into a full chord from just a pure octave in the opening. And it goes back. After it arrives at that full chord, then it falls again. And there are these waves. So these are the gestures that are pulling us through. And you have to play it in a live manner. It can't simply be the notes. Still nice music, but it doesn't say the same thing. So that's what interests me, is what do we see on the page, even as simple as this is a long note and these are some short notes that mean something, and physically it translates into something. So the Galli is a bit earlier. It's from 1690s, late 90s, and it's in a much simpler form than the Bach. We get a skeletal structure. And so you'll see upon first glance in the score, very simple in what to do with that. You can still follow some gesture. Again, it's the long notes and the short notes can show stasis or moving forward. But maybe it's just the bass line. So one of the fun things about playing this music is that you get to figure out how to realize it and make it into something beautiful and full. Now we jump to the 1950s. I've taken these Feldman pieces and I'm imposing some of the tonality from Bach and Gali on these pieces so that they can function as a bridge into the newer sound world that we're going to enter with Lachenmann and Xenakis. Feldman states in the performer's notes that you can choose any pitches that you want as long as it fits the confines that he states in the score. That's the range, timbre, and the duration of the notes. So what's so cool in these pieces by Feldman is that there's so much choice left to the performer, and we see gestures in their purest forms. So we're just seeing boxes within boxes in this score. It's a graph score, and it's a very primitive way of writing in a sense, but it's pretty much how I see notes in general. This is projection 1 by Feldman, and I've imposed some of the tonality of Gali on this. In intersection 4 of Feldman, we see that there are just numbers in boxes. And so the performer has to choose all of the pitches within those ranges and try to fit the right number of notes in these spaces. So like the Gali, which has a very simple structure that allows much room for the performer to embellish and realize it, so also in Lachenmann's Pression, there are sort of abstract instructions that leave a lot of room, partly just from the nature of the writing being so foreign that people approach this information very differently, but also the specifications in the score itself change based on what instrument you're playing. There's a lot of sound effects. But the really interesting thing with Lachenmann is that you're getting the purest forms of gestures, in that what you see is what you get, or what you see is what you see. But it's that the mechanism itself that is called for in the score is what makes the sound. So we have a section where the performer is asked to play by placing the bow on the bridge as an amplifier, and then is asked to play the stick and the hair of the bow. There's another section that's quite interesting where we play under the strings and on the body of the instrument. And the pitch is determined much by just the placement of the bow. There are some surprising similarities between Xenakis Kotos and Bach's Fifth Suite. We have largely gestural writing, these sweeping gestures. We have very highly sophisticated embellishments and specific writing. And they're both depicting some sort of struggle Now, in the case of Kotos, this piece is depicting Kotos, the son of Uranos and Gaius, and he was a 100-armed god, and this is depicting sort of this struggle of so many limbs and the strength and the power of this monster, really. And you'll see in this writing that it depicts it simply by the difficulty. This is famously an impossible piece to play, and it asks for some impossible things. But it's the job of the performer to struggle with it and try to present it in a good light. So I'm going to just show one point in the middle of this piece that has these arrows in the score, and they're showing when it is impossible to play these two notes at the same time that you're supposed to try to. So I hope that you've seen some of the connections that have taken place between these wildly different pieces, that you find the colors, the palettes that the composers are using are not necessarily so different, that there's so much freedom allowed to the performer in their interpretation, what you see on the page and how it is realized through sound. There are so many connections between all of these sound worlds of these different composers. But I hope most of all that it's drawn you into experiencing the direct connection of sound and gesture, and that gesture can be a pleasure to the ear simply in its own nature, and not through highly stylized, constructed pieces. That's been the goal of this project, and I hope that this recording draws you in to experiencing these sounds in a fuller way.